Hello everyone. So today we will be looking at the chapter which investigates the physical and cognitive changes that are happening during adolescence, right? And when we talk about adolescence, we mean the years from 11 to 18, right? And adolescence it's termed as the transition period from childhood to adulthood, right? So when you are, for example, when we've looked at the age ranges of 6 to 11, right? So we said that this is middle childhood, right? And now we're looking at adolescence, right? We're looking at this time period in which you are, when you're, for example, 12, you're no longer a child, but you're not an adult, right? So this is the transitionary period, right, that we have in terms of, and this goes till you are 18, right? When you're no longer a child, but you're not an adult as yet as well. And this is the age range that we term adolescence, right? And when we talk about the physical changes, right, that are occurring during adolescence, right? So one of the first things that will come to your mind, right, will be puberty, right? Now, what exactly is puberty? If we look at the definition of puberty, what we see is that puberty is defined as a flood of biological events, right, that lead to an adult-sized body, right, as well as sexual maturity, right? So, to repeat it, puberty is a flood of biological events that results in an adult-sized body and sexual maturation, right? Now, when we talk about an adult-sized body, right, and this is one of the things that you might have noticed, as soon as, someone becomes an adolescent or someone becomes a teenager, so let's suppose they're 13 or 14, suddenly they go through what we call a growth spurt, right? And so, suddenly they will get very, very tall all of a sudden. This is something that you might remember from the days when you were in school, that, you knew someone or you had a friend and you meet them after a month, let's suppose, because you've been away. And suddenly they have gained a lot in terms of height, right? Their voice might have, if they were a boy, right? So there might be changes to their voice, right? If you're talking about girls, what you might see is that, there are changes to the way that they look in terms of, how their body proportions are, right? In terms of, again, you might have, changes in terms of height, weight, right? Fat, right? The amount of fat that they tend to accumulate, because this is one of the things that we'll see, that the biological changes, the hormonal changes, right, that are occurring in boys and girls, right? And we have two hormones that are responsible for a lot of this growth. So the first of these is the growth hormone, and the other is called thyroxine, right? And we've looked at these earlier as well, right? So, these have the secretions of these hormones, right? They have been paving the way for the developmental changes that are coming, right? And these are majorly responsible for, the changes that you're seeing in terms of body size, right? When we talk about sexual maturity, however, right? So these are the hormones that are responsible for body size. However, when we talk about sexual maturation, right? The hormone that we see is primarily responsible, or actually the hormones that we say are primarily responsible are the hormones of estrogen, right, and androgens, right? And usually we tend to think of estrogen as being, the hormone that is present in women's bodies, and, androgens as being the hormones that are present in male bodies. But, both men and women, both males and females, have both estrogen and androgen. It's just that they have them in different proportions. One of the things that we see is that these hormones as well are responsible for what's happening in terms of body size, right? Especially when we talk about the hormones that are present in men, in males, right? We see that they do contribute to muscle size, to, the development of muscles, to the proportion of muscle to fat, right? With regards to estrogen as well, we see that this has an influence on how much fat you're accumulating and where you're accumulating it, right? When we talk about it in terms of sexual maturation, right? So what we see is, so if you look at what's happening in terms of sexual maturation, right? So what we see in terms of boys is that the hormone testosterone, right? That is responsible for the enlargement of male sexual organs such as the testes. It's also responsible for the gains in height, right? It's responsible for building up muscle. It's also responsible for the facial hair that you see emerging on young boys' faces as they enter adolescence, right? So this is what's happening in terms of testosterone. In females, what you see is that estrogens that are being released, right, they are impacting the body in terms of they have their influence on the development of breasts, for example, right? Then also the development of pubic hair, right? And also the accumulation of fat, right? And this is one of the things that you'll see, that sometimes when girls hit puberty, right, you do see that there tend to be weight changes. Sometimes some girls will put on quite a bit of weight during this time, so that can be because of hormonal changes, but obviously it can be due to other factors as well, right? So this is the sort of development that we see in adolescence can be divided into two broad categories, and we've talked about this earlier as well. So one are the physical changes in terms of body size that we see, right? Body proportions that we see. And then the other bit is the sexual maturity, right? Or sexual maturation, right? When we talk about the physical changes that are happening, so we have said that those are most apparent in the form of what we see and what we call a growth spurt. Sorry about that. Yes. So what we see in terms of a growth spurt, right? And what we see is that when we talk about a growth spurt, right, this is basically what we mean by a growth spurt is that it is the rapid increase, right, in something like height and weight, right? What you see is that, when we talk about the growth spurt, right, the growth spurt in girls tend to happen earlier than boys. On average, it happens around 2 years earlier, right? So the growth spurt for girls is almost underway as they are 10 years of age, right? For boys, it starts later. And this is one of the reasons why you will have noticed that during, middle school or high school, it would be that, girls would be taller than boys and they would look more mature. And this is one of the things we'll see as we go along as well. And you can see it in this picture as well, that you compare Andy and Amy, right? And if you look at their pictures, what you see is that if you compare Andy, and this is one of the things you'll notice when you look at this picture as well, that if you look at Andy at 11 years and you look at Amy at 12 years, right? So is there a difference that you can see? I think you can see quite a bit of difference for Amy at 13 years and Andy at 12 years, right? Amy looks a lot more grown up than Andy. However, if you compare both of them again at 15 years, you'll see that that difference no longer exists, right? So this is one of the things that, because pubertal growth spurts are occurring for girls earlier than they're for boys, right? So there will be these changes that you'll notice at different ages, right? Girls tend to reach their adult body size earlier than boys, right? And one of the things that's interesting is that adolescence is the time period during which there is a vast difference. There's a vast difference in between the two sexes when we look at, things like physical size, when we look at things like, the ages at which they're maturing, right? So the differences between boys and girls tend to become bigger, right? They tend to become more vast, right? So that's another thing that we have, and they become vaster than they've ever been, right? So this is usually also because you have not just changes in terms of body size, but you also have changes in terms of something like body sorry about that fat to muscle makeup, right? So one of the things that you'll see is that boys tend to have more muscle, right? In this proportion, they tend to have more muscle, and girls tend to accumulate more fat, right? So they're no longer able to compete physically, and this is why usually by middle or high school, you will have sports periods that are different for girls and boys, right? Because again, in terms of strength, in terms of something like force, girls can no longer compete with boys if you consider, just the physical element of it as well. By this age, they cannot. When we looked at earlier ages, we said that the physical element is, not so substantial, right? When we talk about the growth spurt happening in adolescence, what we see is that it is so significant that you see adolescents adding something like 10 to 11 inches in height, right? So this is, quite a bit of difference in terms of height, and then something like 50 to 75 pounds in terms of weight, right? So again, this is extremely significant. This is a huge difference, right? When we talk about, what you'll see is that for most adolescents, right, the physical changes are almost complete by 14 years of age. But this, we're talking about an average, right? Because what we say is that a girl's growth spurt starts after she's 10, and for a boy it starts after he's 12, right? However, because adolescence, as a time period occupies so many different changes, it constitutes so many different changes, right? What we do see is that it's a better idea to break up adolescence into these three different categories. So we have early adolescence, right? During which most major pubertal, changes have occurred. So this is from 11 to 12 to 14 years, right? And what's happening here is that this is a period during which there's a rapid pubertal, there are rapid pubertal developments, right? Then we have what we call middle adolescence, right? During which is the time period from 14 to 16, and this is when, pubertal development, so this is rapid, and this is, the pubertal development is almost complete, right? And the third bit is when you have late adolescence, right? And this is from 16 to 18, right? And during this stage, you have the individual taking on a full adult appearance, right? And they are also ready to take on adult roles, right? All right, so when we're talking about, the rapid pubertal developments that are occurring during early adolescence, right? So we were talking about the growth spurt, and then we were talking about how that's occurring in the two different sexes at different ages, right? Now, another thing that we talk about is body proportions, right? Now, when we look at how adolescents are growing, right? So we see that the cephalosodal trend, right, that we had seen earlier in infancy, right, it reverses. Now, what do we mean by saying that it reverses? One of the things that you might have seen in adolescents is that they tend to have very big feet, very big hands, right? Now, according to the cephalosodal trend, so I don't think I've spelled it out right, but cephalosodal, right? Now it's better, right? So this basically what it means is that you have, the torso growing first, right? The center growing first, and then it goes to the periphery, right? Now this tends to reverse, right? So the periphery grows before the torso now, right? Now what is at the periphery? It's obviously the hands and the feet, right? Now what's happening is that these are growing at a faster rate than the torso, right? That is why you have, adolescents, with these awkward body proportions, right? And they again have longer legs, right, than their torsos. They have smaller torsos as compared to legs, and then they have also these giant hands and feet, right? Then there are sex differences in terms of body proportions as well, right? Now, what are these sex differences? Now, when we look at the sex differences, right, what we see is that in terms of when we look at boys, right, their shoulders are becoming wider, right, as relative to their hips, whereas in girls you will see the opposite trend, that the hips tend to widen with relative to the shoulders, right? So that's another thing that you have that's different, right? Now, when we also consider something like motor development, right, one of the things that you see is that boys tend to really make strides in different areas of gross motor performance, right? And you will have them showing more strength, right? Their speed, running speed, for example, will increase, right? Their endurance will be better as well. However, what you see is that these capabilities do not develop to the same extent in girls, and their abilities tend to cap off around age 14. So, again, this is something we talked about earlier as well, that boys and girls are no longer matched physically, right? However, we talked about this earlier as well, that there seems to be, a cultural component to it as well, right? Now, so we've talked about, the physical maturation, the physical changes somewhat. Now we'll come to the sexual maturation bit, right? Now, what we see is that when we talk about sexual maturation, right, so we can see differences in two different, parts of the body, right? Now, some of these are called the primary sexual characteristics, right? And the other are called the secondary sexual characteristics, right? Now, what are differences in these? Now, with the primary sexual characteristics, what you'll see is that these involve the reproductive organs, right? Such as, for example, the penis and the scrotum in the males, and the uterus and the vagina in the females, right? So these are the reproductive organs, right? Whereas when we talk about secondary sexual characteristics, right, these are visible on the outside of the body, and they serve as additional signs of sexual maturity, right? So, for example, these are, breast development in girls, right? Even though you do see that in young boys as well, that's because they do have estrogen, right? The hormone estrogen present in their bodies as well. So you have breast development in females, and you have, the appearance of, for example, pubic plus facial hair, right? Underarm hair in both of the sexes, right? So that's something that we call secondary sexual characteristics, right? And what we see is that, when we look at sexual maturation in terms of girls, right? So the marker for that is menarche, right? Now, what is menarche? Menarche is when you get your first menstruation or your first period, right? So that's also a sign of physical maturation, right? And what's happening with the menarche is that usually, for example, the average age in North America, as cited by the book, is something like 13 years. However, I believe in Pakistan, the average age is around 11 years, right? And, with regards to menarche, what you see is that we see something that we call a secular trend when we look at something like menarche. Now, what is a secular trend? One of the things that you might notice when you ask your mothers, for example, when they got their first period, usually that's a little later than the average girl getting her period now. The reason for that is, for some reason, right, the age at which the the first period happens or menarche happens seems to be decreasing, right? This is termed the secular trend, right? Okay, now what's happening in terms of what else is happening in terms of the menarche? Now, one of the things that you have to remember about the menarche is that menarche usually takes place when the height spurt is at its peak, right? However, even when a girl gets her first period, 12 to 18 months after that mark, she will still not be able to get pregnant, right? So it's not that as soon as a girl gets her menstrual cycle, right, she will start releasing ova, right? It's not necessary, right? When we talk about sexual maturation in boys, right, one of the things that we see is that, the first sign that you will have is that there will be enlargement of the testes, right? And you will have what we call the Spermarche, right? Which is basically the first ejaculation, right? And usually that also occurs around age 13.5 on average for an American adolescent. I'm not sure what the average age range for Spermarche is for the average Pakistani boy, right? However, there are quite a bit of individual differences, and this is another thing you must have noticed, that different girls and different boys develop at different ages, right? Within your own peers, you might have noticed this, that there were some who were, they had their growth spurt or their menarche earlier. Some girls would have it later. One of the differences again that you see between boys and girls is that if girls tend to have they tend to bloom, I wouldn't use that word, but if they tend to hit puberty earlier, right, that is associated with quite a lot of negative outcomes. For example, it's associated sometimes with greater anxiety, greater concern about body weight, right? Sometimes they're made fun of because of their more adult-like looking body. With regards to boys, if they hit puberty earlier, right, one of the things that you'll see is that they are actually more confident than other boys their age. So this also seems to be a sex difference that we observe, that in terms of early versus late sexual maturation. Now, if you consider this table, what you see is that you have this breakdown of right. So you have this breakdown, you have this all of these different milestones, and you see, for example, for girls at 10 years of age, they're beginning to develop breasts, right? Then 11.7, they're getting their peak height spurt. 12.5, menarche. Then you also have, by 14 years, the breast growth is completed. For boys, you will see that the age ranges for all of these are later, right? So, for example, the voice begins to deepen at 14 years of age. Spermarche happens usually at 13.5. Peak height spurt happens at 14, whereas for girls it's happening at 11.7, right? So yes, this is a good table to consult if you're looking at the average age at which these pubertal developments occur. Now, if we move ahead and we talk about cognitive development, right? Now, according to Piaget, what's happening with terms of cognitive development is that, sorry about that, again, I think my spelling is giving way here, is that adolescents have reached what he calls formal operational stage, right? The stage of formal operations, right? And according to Piaget, the hallmark of the formal operational stage is hypothetico-deductive reasoning. Now, what exactly is hypothetico-deductive reasoning? So according to Piaget, what's happening is that if adolescents are met with a problem, so for example, you give an adolescent this problem that they basically need to, let's suppose, adjust the speed of a pendulum, right? So there's a pendulum and they need to see what factors affect the speed of it, right? So they will not approach this problem randomly, right? They will create what he calls a hypothesis, right? And what they'll do is that they will systematically, right? What is a hypothesis? It's basically, a tentative statement, right? Or a tentative relationship between two variables. So you might say that the weight of the pendulum, right? If you can alter the weight of the pendulum, that will have an impact on the speed, right? So this would be your hypothesis, right? So the adolescent will always approach any situation with a hypothesis, and they will test this hypothesis, right? And they will do it systematically, in the sense that first, let's suppose if they try to change the weight, then they might also try to change the speed, or the how far you pull this back before you release it. The angle, they might try to alter the angle, this angle, this is what I'm talking about. So they might try to alter this angle as well, right, in order to study the speed of the pendulum, right? So basically what that means is that they will be going into a problem solving situation with certain sets of hypotheses, right? And then they will test those hypotheses and see which one fits, which one works, and which one doesn't, right? So it's a much more refined way of reasoning. It's a much more refined way of looking at the world, of dealing with the world, right? And the most important thing is that they're working with hypotheses. So they are a lot more capable of abstract thinking, right? That's something that we said wasn't present in the earlier stages, right? So even though earlier children could make inferences, but they couldn't make inferences about hypothetical situations because those involved abstract thinking. So again, abstract thinking is something that's developing during this stage, according to Piaget, right? Now again, there's a lot of criticism with regards to this as well, because some critics say that a lot of adults don't even reach this stage of hypothetical deductive reasoning, right? So it's not just adolescents, it's that you're focusing on school going children, you're focusing on children who are going to high school, and therefore this doesn't apply to children all over the world, for example, adolescents, all over the world, right? And obviously the information processing perspective takes another approach to it and talks about how there are differences that are occurring in different capabilities, right? So for example, the speed at which you process information is getting faster, and that's causing the differences that we see. That's something that we'll look at later. But yes, this is basically in very simple and very, very basic terms what Piaget's idea is about cognitive development.